What I hope to do tonight over the next 30 to 40 minutes is introduce you to two of the clients I have represented since September 11. One, a United States citizen, a lawyer in Portland, Oregon, Brandon Mayfield. The other, a Sudanese hospital administrator and charity worker who spent more than 5 years in United States custody, most of it in Guantanamo Bay. And in talking about them, I'll also be talking a little bit about some of the issues that moved me to join the fight for the men in Guantanamo and that we have been battling in the court and also in the court of public opinion. So let me start by taking you back a little more than 2 years to March of 2006. I got onto a little needle-nosed airplane at the airport in Fort Lauderdale for the flight to Guantanamo Bay. A flight that should have taken 45 minutes if you fly straight across, but because of the state of relations between our government and Cuba, we have to go all the way around to the eastern end of the island and then back down to the southern shore where our naval base is located. Armed in order to get onto the base with a security classification from the FBI, and with a theater clearance from our Department of Defense. It had not occurred to me till I got onto the cases that Guantanamo Bay is viewed as a theater of war, so that people cannot get there without permission in the form of a war theater clearance. Landing at the base, we were met by a military escort, taken to what's called the combined bachelor quarters on the leeward side of the base for a night, sort of a funky college dorm type hotel, where the lawyers who have clients there spend their time, and where the men and women on the base cross over from the windward side where the heart of the base is for a weekend getaway. Get up the following morning, get onto a rickety old school bus for a ride down to the ferry terminal for the short ride across the bay to the windward side, the heart of the base, and the part of the base where the prison is located. You go around a bend on the bus, and there off in the distance is the beautiful blue Caribbean. And sitting right on the shore in front of the water is the prison at Guantanamo Bay. Go through a couple of military checkpoints, up to a fence with razor wire, through a gate, through another gate, through another gate, and eventually into the inside courtyard of what is called Camp Echo, the place where all the visits were taking place with the men who were in prison there in the spring of 2006. Now, I was there that day to see one of the 7 clients my office and I have been representing in Guantanamo. The man I was there to see, Adel Hassan Hamad, the Sudanese hospital administrator and aid worker. But at that time, when I went to see him that day, I did not have any idea who or what he was. It was actually not until the very week that I left Portland for the flight to Florida that our government deigned to tell me that he was Sudanese and that his primary language was Arabic. Now, we'd made a guess, and we had hired an Arabic-speaking interpreter, but we didn't know for sure until just days before we went down there. I had not seen any official documentation on him. And the only thing that I knew, or perhaps I should say that I had been told by our government, was that Adel Hassan Hamad and our other clients there were, in the words of our former Secretary of Defense, among the worst of the worst. In the words of our President, our Vice President, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State, that he was one of the men who had been picked up on a battlefield. Public pronouncements as recently as this year by our President, that all the men in Guantanamo were picked up on the battlefield, that all the men in Guantanamo were hardened fighters for Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. That's what our government had said. And that's all I knew on that first visit. Again, that's all I was told. I didn't know anything The reality, as I have learned it after getting into these cases, a reality that I've learned from reviewing material provided by our government, facts from the Department of Defense, are that fewer than 8% of the men who were ever in Guantanamo were ever part of Al-Qaeda. Fewer than 8%. Fewer than 5% were actually picked up on a battlefield by United States forces. Less than 1 out of 20. And fewer than 50% of the men our government has held there were ever even charged, and I use that word loosely for those lawyers in the room, with having committed a hostile act against the United States or our allies. As I learned eventually, Adil Hassan Hamad and a number of my other clients were part of that 50%. Men who were not ever part of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban and who had never committed a hostile act against our government or any of our allies. But I didn't know that first day. The visits in Guantanamo are surreal and perverse. I visited clients in the Broome County Jail. I've visited clients in the New York State prison system, visited clients in the godforsaken basements of the criminal court in Brooklyn, New York. And now in Oregon, I have clients on death row. But there is something that is different in Guantanamo. There is something different in terms of the intensity of the visits. And that difference comes in large part because all the other people I have represented, I've represented in a justice system where there are meaningful charges, where there are prosecutors, where there are men and women in black robes who make decisions most of the time fairly and squarely. And in Guantanamo, none of that exists. So in the prison that first day, into the inner courtyard of Camp Echo, on a concrete path, walking with a guard, past a couple of the wooden structures, roughly 20 by 40 each one divided in half with 2 doors with a number on the front up to door number 12. The guard unlocks the door, and there, sitting in front of us, the first thing we see toward the back of the cell, a little Formica folding table. Behind the Formica folding table, a little folding chair. Seated in the chair, a very dark-skinned man. And I must say I was surprised to see a dark-skinned man. Perhaps that was my inherent racism. I was going to see an Arab. And my vision of what an Arab was not a man with black skin. I've since learned a great deal about the diversity of the Arab population, and the Arab population in particular as it exists in Sudan. The man sitting there wearing a white shirt, white pants, a white kufi, and underneath the table, an eye hook drilled into the concrete floor. And my client literally chained to the floor, in my eyes, chained to the floor like a dog. And for the 2 days of that visit, and for the 2 days of each of the subsequent visits that I had with him, he and each of my other clients sits chained to the floor like a dog. To try to give you some idea of what it's like, the intensity of this emotion, I want to read to you a paragraph or two from the book that describe the first visit with Adil, the ending of this first visit. The Pat to whom I refer in this paragraph is Assistant Federal Defender Pat Ehlers, who was working on Adil's case with me. Camp Delta is the portion of the prison where Adil lived when he was not in the Camp Echo for the visits. It was difficult when Pat and I had to leave at the end of the second day of our visit. Pat and I were about to go back to the larger world, but Adil was headed back to the loneliness of Camp Delta. Pat said his goodbye and shook Adel's hand. I said goodbye in English and Arabic, Salam Alaikum, and shook Adel's hand. I turned to get my papers, but before I could pick them up, Adel asked, "When will I go home?" "We can only promise that we will fight for you in every way we can," I told him. Adel's eyes, which had been so calm for most of the meeting, started to darken. He reached out again and took my right hand, at first with his right hand, but then with both. Tears welled up in his eyes. He could see the ray of hope that had entered the cell with us beginning to die with our leaving. I put my left hand over our joined hands, and we stood there looking at each other. There was no sound in the cell. I'm not sure anyone was even breathing. I'm going to leave Adel sitting in that cell in Guantanamo for a minute. And I'm going to shift frames. I'm going to take you back now to March of 2004. You may recall that on March 11, 2004, a series of bombs exploded at 7 train stations in Madrid, Spain. 191 people were killed. More than 2,000 were injured, and among the dead were 3 Americans. Spanish National Police were immediately on the job, and they found a bag of unexploded detonators at one of the train stations, and they were able to lift a fingerprint, a latent fingerprint from that bag. They ran the fingerprint through their system, and they were not able to come up with a match. So they sent it electronically through Interpol to law enforcement agencies around the world, including our Federal Bureau of Investigation. And within a week, the FBI declared a match. They declared a 100% match. And I say to the lawyers in the room who've ever worked with experts, have you ever heard an expert say anything with 100% certainty? I don't recall that I have. Experts like to talk about things with reasonable degrees of scientific certainty, whatever that means, but never 100% certainty. But the FBI said 100% certainty. And when we later saw some affidavits in that case, they said that 3 senior FBI examiners, each with more than 30 years' experience, had reached this conclusion with 100% certainty. After declaring the match, a match with Brandon Mayfield, Portland, Oregon lawyer. They started a full court investigation of him. They went to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and they obtained warrants for eavesdropping at his house and at his law office. They obtained warrants under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to engage in sneak and peek searches at his house. And sneak and peek, the words mean exactly what they say. In a normal situation, when the police go for a warrant, they have to show probable cause that a crime has been committed. Under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, you don't need to show probable cause that a crime has been committed if you are engaged, at least in part, in foreign intelligence investigations. And unlike a traditional search warrant where you either have to knock and announce, or if danger exists, you don't have to knock, you have to leave the warrant. In sneak and peek searches, you don't have to let anyone know that you've been in the home. And they got authorization for those searches. And they started traditional surveillance, 24 hours a day, around the clock, of Brandon and his wife and his 3 children at his home and at his law office. And on May the 6th, the FBI went to the federal court in Oregon and presented evidence, they said, to justify Brandon's arrest as a material witness to the Madrid bombings. The affidavit in support of the search warrant said, first and foremost, we have this 100% identification by 3 senior FBI agents. But the affidavit then went on to say, there's probable cause to arrest Brandon because he is a Muslim. And in another paragraph, they said there's probable cause because he's married to an Egyptian woman. And in another paragraph, they said he's been observed going into a mosque. And then, horror of horrors, they said there's probable cause to arrest him because he's a lawyer. Yeah, I like that one too. And in the next paragraph, they went on in very great detail to explain that one of Brandon's clients, a client he'd represented in a child custody battle, had been convicted of an act of terrorism in Portland, and that man, Brandon's client, held strong anti-American and anti-Semitic views. Not Brandon, but his client. The FBI took Brandon downtown to the federal courthouse in Portland that day, and that night, Assistant Defender Chris Schatz and I started our representation. Representation that turned out to be the most intense 19 days, and I counted every long one of them, of my legal career. 19 days in which we pulled a team together in the office that included Chris and some younger lawyers and a team of investigators to try to find out what on earth is this about. 19 days. Fortunately, we were in front of a federal judge. Now, to give you some flavor for that 19-day period and to bring together the Guantanamo and the Oregon representation, the representation of the alien and the representation of the citizen, I want to read another paragraph from the book about the first meeting that Chris and I had with Brandon and one of the things that we had to talk to him about in this war on terror. It was tough to talk to Brandon about the possibility of a death penalty charge. Yes, a death penalty charge. The affidavit, while listing him as a material witness, said that he was wanted in connection with capital murder, and that if he were charged, he would be facing the death penalty. And that was something that the United States Attorney's Office never took off the table until Brandon was finally released. Talking to Brandon about a death penalty charge, it's like a doctor telling a patient with what he thinks is a routine stomach ache that he has pancreatic cancer. While the death penalty hovered over our discussions, as long as Brandon remained a witness, it was somewhere off in the distance. But more immediate and even more difficult to talk about was the possibility that we might not ever get to see Brandon again, a possibility made real by the policies of the Bush administration. On April 20 and 28, less than 2 weeks before Brandon's arrest, Solicitor General Ted Olson and his Chief Deputy Paul Clement had argued to the Supreme Court on behalf of the President and his administration that the President had the power to take or order anyone, including United States citizens, arrested in the United States, out of the criminal justice system and hold them indefinitely in military detention without charges or trial. I told Brandon about the argument and that it's possible you won't be here tomorrow. In light of the administration's stance, I had to add, Brandon, this is real. They've actually done it. Hamdi and Padilla are in the naval brig. Now, Hamdi and Padilla are two United States citizens. One arrested at the airport in Chicago, supposedly having something to do with a dirty bomb. The very morning of his first appearance in court, he was whisked out of the federal detention center and taken incommunicado for 3.5 years to a naval brig. Hamdi was arrested in Afghanistan, brought to this country, and similarly held incommunicado and told that he could have no lawyer and no process. Trained in the law and believing in American justice, Brandon could not accept what I had said. But I'm a United States citizen. So are they. It doesn't matter. His voice rising, he barked back, I'm a lawyer. I have cases pending in the federal court next door. I understand, Brandon. This is the new reality. We have to deal with it. I'm going to stop for a second and leave Brandon sitting in a jail cell. Not the same cell as Otto, but a cell in Portland, Oregon. And I want to shift gears. I want to shift gears back, eventually, to Binghamton, New York. I want to bring this story here. in answering a question that I'm asked every time I speak about this work. How is it that I, as the federal defender in Oregon, end up representing people in Guantanamo Bay? And more importantly, why did it seem to me to be so important to get involved in this work? And in answering that question, I come back to Binghamton in 1979. I had spent the previous 4 years working in the district attorney's office in Brooklyn. The job opened up for the county defender here, and I followed my muse north, followed my heart north, to become the public defender. To fight for justice as I had been in Brooklyn, but to fight for it in a different way. In the spring of 1981, 2 years after leaving the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office for the other side of the scales of justice, as the head of the Broome County Public Defender's Office in Binghamton, New York, I went to a New York State Defenders Association board meeting at Grossinger's, one of the, at least it was then, decaying hotels in the Catskill Mountains. In Grossinger's glory days, the often jeans-clad and long-haired defenders would have been out of place and unwelcome in the midst of the leisure suits, fur coats, and buffet tables piled high with bagels, blintzes, and several kinds of lox. But by the early 80s, Grossinger's was hungry for business, and our less than affluent crowd of defenders blended in nicely with the chipped paint and frayed carpet. I was exhausted when I checked in, having just completed the grueling murder trial for a Vietnam veteran who had been convicted of murdering his own children. It was at the board meeting that I talked to Milton Adler. I could not get the images of Chet's children out of my head. The trial left me shaken and wondering how much more I could take. But Adler was in his early 70s and still working as a line assistant in the New York Legal Aid Office, side by side in the trenches with the kids who had just gotten out of law school. Milton had risen through the ranks at Legal Aid, and in the mid-1960s he became the chief of the criminal division, responsible for the hundreds of assistant defenders in the 5 boroughs of New York City. After a decade, he had tired of the political infighting and bureaucracy and gone back to what he loved best, representing the poor and downtrodden in trouble. I was in awe of Milton and mystified. I was feeling tired after only 2 years of defending, and wondered how he had been doing it for nearly 50. I asked him how he had kept his fight and why. He fixed me with his dark eyes, set under bushy eyebrows and a head still full of wavy but graying hair, part quizzical, part pity, part full of a wisdom that said, if you stick with it, you will know. His answer has kept me going ever since, when my energy has flagged. If not me, kid, who? Let's go back to Brandon first, sitting in that jail cell. We filed motions. We challenged what everyone in the defense bar, at least, and the Muslim community in Oregon viewed as quite improper religious profiling. We challenged what we viewed as abuse of the material witness statute, a statute that's intended to bring people in and hold them in jail to get evidence from them, not as an FBI memo that later surfaced said because they were afraid he would be outed by the media. They wanted to hold him until they could develop enough evidence to charge him. He stayed in jail until the Spanish said to the FBI in late May, we have identified this fingerprint. It is not Brandon Mayfield's. It belongs to an Algerian. And we learned that that was not the first time the Spanish had told our government that this was not Brandon's print. They had actually told our government that 3 weeks before his arrest. And if any of you buy the book, you can read the whole story of that. You can even see a photograph of the letter they sent to our government on April 13th, a letter in which the word negative is actually typed in bold print, so there could be no mistake about the message they were conveying to the FBI. To their credit, when the Spanish told the government at the end of May that this was an Algerian's fingerprint, the United States Attorney and the head of the FBI in Oregon immediately moved for Brandon's release. To their discredit, the FBI leaders and the Department of Justice leaders in Washington went up on Capitol Hill and said behind closed doors, "Don't worry, guys, the FBI fingerprinting system is really good. We made this mistake when we were working from a bad copy of a partial print, but as soon as we got the real print, we figured it out." On June 8th, Attorney General Ashcroft said that under oath at a U.S. Senate committee hearing. Now, when I got a call from Washington from some of these staffers who said to me, "Mr. Wax, this is what the FBI is telling us. This is what the Attorney General has just said under oath." I'm sitting there in my office with a copy of the fingerprint because we had a judge who ordered it given to us by the government. And it was not a bad copy, and it was not a partial print. And I'm sitting there looking at this saying, I don't think that our Attorney General has just told the truth under oath. And I now say this to you. You don't have to take my word for it. Because the FBI convened an international team of experts in the summer of 2004 to try to figure out what went wrong. And that team of international experts has said the print was perfectly usable. There was no problem with it at all. What happened here was entirely operator error. The FBI abandoned the scientific method. When the first man looked at the print and said, "Gee, I think I have a match," instead of having a blind review by a second examiner, "Hey, Harry, come on over here. Take a look." And the two guys are looking at the computer screen together. "Wow, Joe, it looks like you did it." Then they call over Sam, and the three of them are there together. This team of international experts said, you really can't run a fingerprint operation that way. And then they said something else, which I think is even more significant and goes to some of the broader issues in this war on terror, as it's called. They said that this mistake was also the product of what they called, and this is the FBI's team itself. Again, this is not my opinion. This is the FBI, if you want to believe them. Big case pressure, they said. That the examiners succumbed to big case pressures. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that the FBI and our government leaders have a very weighty responsibility to solve acts of terrorism, to prevent acts of terrorism, to keep us safe. And it's not easy. But what this team said is that they get so carried away by that responsibility that they lose perspective. That the urgency of solving this big case, in essence, caused them to act as though they had blinders on. They would see only what they expected to see. And they would only look for what would be consistent with their theory. And I think that that's part of what we've been dealing with in Guantanamo and in some of the other aspects of this war on terror. Brandon was released. The case was turned over to civil lawyers. Eventually, they won a nice settlement from our government for what our government had done to him. The Attorney General's Inspector General, an unsung hero, Glenn Fine, someone should write a book about him someday, did an investigation of this matter, looked at the religious profiling, looked at the use of the Patriot Act, looked at the terror that had been injected into the Mayfield home when the FBI had broken in under the Patriot Act and bungled it, leaving telltale signs that the Mayfields had seen, of course having no idea that it was their own government that had broken into their home. And in the book, I tell the stories, hopefully not in legal terms, but in lay terms, of what happened and what they found. So let's shift back to Adil, sitting in that jail cell. This man who I say is a Sudanese hospital administrator, who our president said is one of the hardened worst of the worst. Why do I stand here today and tell you he's an innocent man? I tell you that because I did with him what I do with all my clients. I listened to what he had to tell me. Eventually, the government provided me some information. The charges that they filed against him, again, I use that word loosely. And what did our government accuse him of doing? Running a hospital, of being an administrator for a charity, of delivering food to refugee camps in Pakistan, refugee camps for the victims of the Afghan Soviet wars and then the Afghan civil wars. Those were the charges against him, according to our government. To be sure, they included in the charges the fact that some of the men in the charities for which he worked held anti-American views, and that some may, and I repeat, may, have helped al-Qaeda along the way. But they never said that Adil Hassan Hamad did anything of the sort. So I listened to him, and I heard him tell me the same thing that I was eventually able to read that he had told the government, and I accepted it with some degree of skepticism. Anyone who's ever defended someone in a criminal case knows that the protestations of innocence that you hear on day 1 sometimes melt away on day 3 or day 30. And it's my job to try to figure out, suspend judgment, what is this about? And I sent a team of investigators and lawyers into the war zone in Afghanistan, into Pakistan. I personally traveled to Sudan in search of the people my client had told me he had worked with. And other teams from the office did the same thing on behalf of a number of our other clients. And we found the doctors with whom he had worked at the hospital. We learned that this was a non-political hospital. We found the Afghan ministers who were working there. The Afghan ministers under both the Taliban and the Karzai regime, who said, yes, indeed, this hospital was a wonderful place, a non-political place, providing services to roughly 300,000 people in one of the eastern regions of Afghanistan. My client had told me that, you know, Steve, there are times when we would be delivering food and it was in boxes stamped product of the USA. And the Afghan ministers confirmed that the World Food Program was aiding that hospital and delivering American food. That's what we found. So what do we do with it? I'm a lawyer. I'm supposed to do something in court. But remember, I had to tell Brandon about the arguments that the Bush administration had been making, that the president of this country had the power on his own, unilaterally, to seize and detain people indefinitely. And the position of the Bush administration was, from the fall of 2001 until this past June, that the federal courts had absolutely no authority and no jurisdiction and could not hear any claims of any of these men. The president asserting a power that had literally been stripped from the English kings in the 1600s to act without any review by anyone. For 2 years, from 2002 to 2004, in the first round of habeas corpus litigation, when they made those arguments, they prevailed in the lower courts in Washington, D.C. Until June of 2004, when the Supreme Court, for the first of 3 times, rebuked them and said, no, Mr. President, you do not have that power. The writ of habeas corpus requires, under our Constitution, judicial review of your actions. That's why I'm in the cases, to represent these men in habeas corpus actions. But as soon as we got into the cases, the administration and Congress rewrote the law and said, whoa, Supreme Court, you think that we have to go to court? No, we don't. Here's a new statute that strips the federal courts of power. The Supreme Court in 2006 said to them for a second time, can't do this. The American system requires some process. And in the fall of 2006, they rewrote the law again. So we file our pleadings in the federal court in Washington. And in the lower courts, there's a lot of hand-wringing and no action. So one of the younger guys in the office says to me, Steve, let's go to YouTube. I say, what's that? Seriously, fall of 2006, I didn't even know what it was. I do now. So we made a video, and we put it on YouTube. And eventually, that video actually has an impact. A couple of months later, full of our success with YouTube ratings that are #1 on their political charts, they come back to me and they say, let's do another one. Let's get a celebrity to do this. What better celebrity to go to than a real president, the president of the West Wing? And we get Martin Sheen to volunteer his time. An Academy Award-winning producer in Los Angeles, Frida Mock, to volunteer her time. And they put together for us one heck of a presentation with President Sheen saying in his beautiful presidential voice, no president has the power to do what the incumbent in the White House says he can do. Well, our client doesn't get out of custody. We gather up all this evidence of innocence and we send it to the federal courts. And we're told by the administration, judges, you may not read it. I sent it down to the military, sent it to Guantanamo. In order to do this defense work, you have to believe that if you keep knocking your head against the wall, eventually something cracks. So we sent it to the Secretary of Defense, to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, to the men in charge of the process that had been set up in Guantanamo, which leads to the title of the book, the Kafkaesque process, where the men cannot have lawyers, cannot see the evidence, cannot even know what the real charges against them are. But we tried. And I get an email response one day when I sent it down there. Out of office, automatic reply. Those of you who use that, beware. This fellow, I tell this story in the book, whose name is changed in the book for security reasons, sent an out-of-office email reply that should have gone internally to his fellows in the Department of Defense, but it went to the external link that I had used, and it had his personal cell phone number on it. I called. How did you get this number? You gave it to me. And I found one of the many wonderful men and women in our military who understand that the defense of liberty involves not only standing behind a gun, but also standing up for American values. And this man actually moved the military. It may have only been an inch, but they moved, and actually created a process in Guantanamo for review of new evidence, which they had never seen from any of the lawyers until we sent ours down. And then, still frustrated, everything tied up in court, we contacted the Sudanese. And my friend said to me, you're nuts. The Sudanese government, the butchers of Darfur, as some people in this country call them, why are you contacting them? And the answer was, I'm a defense attorney. I'm going to try everything I can possibly try on behalf of my client as long as it's within the law and ethics. And for their own geopolitical reasons, they opened their doors to us. And in the spring of 2007, I went to Sudan. We gathered up some additional evidence, found some additional people who had worked with the client in Pakistan, and we met with the state minister. We met with the justice minister. We met with President Bashir's top foreign policy advisor. We said, you have in Guantanamo some innocent men. And here is the evidence of innocence of at least one of your clients. Oh, we know him. That's the YouTube detainee. The power of the internet. President Sheen observed in Khartoum by the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Sudan. What would you like us to do, Mr. Wax? Well, I'm a nice Jewish kid sitting in a Muslim country, so what am I supposed to do? I remember the Seder. And in the Seder, there's always this passage where Moses is saying to Pharaoh, let my people go. So I suggested to the modern day Pharaoh of Sudan, why don't you just say to the Pharaoh of the United States, Let my people go? How would you like us to do that? Write them a letter. What would you like us to say in the letter? Let my people go. And talk about my client, Adil Hassan Hamad, because you've seen the evidence of his innocence, sir. And the day after we left, the foreign minister wrote to Condoleezza Rice and said, "Dear Madam Secretary, let our people go." He didn't refer to the Seder, but I didn't really need it. And over the summer of 2007, the foreign minister, the state minister, came to the United States, met with Deputy Secretary of State Negroponte, and they negotiated about Darfur. And they negotiated about Adil Hassan Hamad and the other Sudanese prisoners. And throughout the fall, while we're still frustrated and tied up in court and not getting a hearing anywhere, the negotiations proceeded until in December, Adil went home. I've spoken with him a number of times since then, and he says to me, "Steve, I want justice." And I shake my head in amazement at this man who spent 5 years, 4 months, and 25 days in prison. 6 months in Pakistan, 2 at the Bagram Air Base, and nearly 5 years in Guantanamo. He still has enough belief in our system to say, "I want justice." And so my fight for him continues in the court now, with the Supreme Court having said in June for the 3rd time, "Mr. President, habeas corpus is alive and well." A decision written by Justice Kennedy, appointed by President Reagan, a justice never known as a particularly liberal man, writing for a 5-4 majority. This is a non-political talk, but there is a fact that those who are going to vote in November might want to keep in mind. Justice Stevens is 87. Justice Ginsburg is not terribly well. One of the presidential candidates believes that the majority opinion was a sound opinion, and that when the majority by Justice Kennedy, the conservative justice, said that in America there is no king-like power in the president, that was a good decision. One of the presidential candidates joined and said that Justice Scalia's dissent, which said you majority will have blood on your hands, wrote it right. That's just a fact, but I digress. My work. I know a few things. There's a lot I don't know. I never sat in the White House. I never sat in the Vice President's office. I never devised any of these policies. I wasn't there when they wrote the torture memos. I wasn't there when they wrote the other memos that justified declaring these men not to be prisoners of war and not entitled to any of the protections of the Geneva Conventions. So I don't know precisely what was going on. But what I know is this, that in my visits to Guantanamo, I was able to bring a ray of hope to the island of despair, to Adil and to the other 6 clients we had there. I know that the black, Sudanese, Muslim, Arab, and the white, Brooklyn-born, Jewish lawyer touched on a fundamental level. I know that we found our common humanity, a common humanity that I think is something that is reflected by the views of the sponsoring agencies who have brought many of you to this room tonight. We were able somehow, sitting in that prison cell with him chained to the floor, to get beyond what is on our surfaces, to get to our core humanity. And I knew that most clearly on the day when he was explaining to me, when Adil was explaining to me why he wasn't coming for the visit from Camp Delta, which was the good camp in Guantanamo, if there is such a thing in that prison, but was coming from one of the camps where the men were kept in solitary confinement 22 hours a day and could not interact with anyone at all. And he leaned across the table at me and he said, "Steve, do you know the game Chutes and Ladders? And I'm sitting there going, how on earth does this man brought up in the desert of Sudan know Chutes and Ladders? And sure I knew it, because I'd been playing it with my kid. Pervasiveness of American culture, but the commonness of us, the common language, the common feelings that we shared. And I also know this, and this is where I'll close and then take some questions, and then if anyone wants to buy a book, be happy to sign it. I know that there are very few places in the world that would pay a guy like me to do the work that I've been doing. And whenever I get angry, and whenever I get frustrated, and there are times I certainly get angry and frustrated in this work, whether it's in Guantanamo or whether it's in Portland, I remember that. I remember that it is your tax dollars that fund the Federal Defender's Office for which I work, and that the Sixth Amendment in our great Constitution is what enables me to do this work, and that there are very few places where that could happen. And when I get angry and frustrated, I bring that back to my mind, that there is a value that this nation still holds dear. And no matter how trampled upon it is sometimes, and no matter how sometimes people pervert the values of this country, that core is there. And it's that core that the federal defender system represents. And that makes me proud. So I'll stop there, say thanks for listening, thanks for coming out, and be happy to answer your questions. Question is whether or not the acts that have been committed by some of those in our administration, including the President and Vice President, are crimes, and whether or not there is any recourse. In 2006, November, the Germans answered that question, and I love the fact that it was the Germans, by initiating criminal action against former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and some others in the administration. Whether anything ever comes of that, who knows? In this country, I think that one of the things you will run into is the fact that in the second of the statutory amendments, the fall of 2006, the Military Commissions Act, the administration and Congress included a clause granting immunity back to 1997 for many acts which would otherwise be considered war crimes. So there will be all sorts of legal impediments. The International Criminal Court could certainly inquire into what has been happening, but our government does not recognize it. So I think that the best that one could hope for, if that is what you want, or the worst that one could expect, if those are your views, would be that someday our government will provide some recompense to the men imprisoned in Guantanamo, as it did 40 years after the Japanese were released from their internment. In 1986, the survivors of the 112,000 Japanese who were imprisoned during World War II were each given $20,000. Perhaps that will happen. And I also say this. Within the legal community, there is a debate about whether those lawyers who wrote some of these memos, the torture memos and some of the others, are war criminals, or whether they were lawyers being zealous advocates for their clients, that is, the president, vice president, etc. You could go online and you could find a tremendous dialogue going on about John Yoo, now a professor at Berkeley, who was one of the authors of the memos for torture when he worked in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice. And you'll find both sides of the coin there. You'll find some people saying he crossed the line. Some people saying that when he wrote memos along with a number of others, I don't want to just lay this on him, that said that unless the actions taken in interrogation lead to impending death, they're not torture. Some people say that is criminal, and that's not being a lawyer. Other people say his client asked him for a definition, he researched it, he may have been wrong, but he was just acting as a lawyer. Bush and Cheney, the president on February 7, 2002 issued what is called the Failed State Proclamation. Proclamation in which they declared that Afghanistan was not a real government under the Taliban. Therefore, the Taliban soldiers, even if they'd been wearing uniforms, did not have to be treated under the Geneva Conventions. Well, he's got a legal memo. Do you prosecute him or not? What it seems to me is perhaps more fruitful to focus on is how to strengthen our institutions, how to strengthen our democracy so it doesn't happen again. Why do we American people let some of these things happen around the world in our name? Why are we not sufficiently informed? Why don't we fund our education system? Why do we put so many people in jails and have them come out and pray again instead of teaching people to be citizens in a democracy? That's where I would devote my energies rather than to seeking prosecutions, which I think will just continue to tear us apart. But that's one man's view. The question is, as a layman, it seems as though the rights of the men in Guantanamo are not the only rights being imperiled, that the rights of U.S. citizens are imperiled as well. And what are the two most important things that we could do in terms of changing the law? One of the reasons why I wrote the book as I did was because I see that linkage. When I had to tell Brandon Mayfield that the government had argued in these Guantanamo cases, Brandon, you may not be here tomorrow, that came right home. And I think that the sayings that have come in any number of forms over the years that a threat to justice or injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If we do not accord the least of us dignity and human rights, then those rights are not safe for any of us. That's why I tell the stories together. So I share that perspective. What are the two most important changes in the law? The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was recently amended again. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was passed in 1978 in response, in large part, to the abuses of the Nixon administration during Watergate and the abuses of the Johnson administration, just sort of probably randomly and pervasively throughout the Vietnam War. A balanced statute written in a bipartisan way. What the president asserted immediately after September 11 was that he was not bound by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And he asserted a power as commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the Constitution to act outside the law and to engage in wiretapping outside the law. And then he got the telecommunication companies to throw their switches for the NSA outside the law. This summer, with the support of both presidential candidates, I would say, that law was changed. It was changed to give the president some of the powers that President Bush had asserted and to expand the circumstances under which the government could act domestically and call it legal in the name of terrorism. I think that that is one of the most dangerous things that we are encountering. In the name of terror, in the name of fear, says the Bush administration and its allies in Congress, the president can act in a way that is inconsistent with our entire history. Now, to be sure, the acts of terrorism are different today, and we face new threats. But I will quote from one of Oregon's judges, Ann Aiken, who, in declaring certain provisions of the Patriot Act unconstitutional, said this: "For 200 years, we have lived well with the balance struck in the founding of this nation and the writing of the Constitution. We don't need to throw out our constitutional structure in order to maintain both our security and our freedom." FISA and the Patriot Act seem to me to upset that balance. And I would spend a fair amount of energy attempting to undo that. Now, beyond that, I will go back to education. I will go to corporate funding of campaigns and the difficulty that little guys like me have in getting a voice. Now, I've been lucky, but it's not easy given the corporate structure that we have. For those who couldn't hear, the comment was, what an amazing group of people here in the room, and we all have come together and can work together to bring back the rule of law. And I want to add my voice to that, because I'm often asked by people when I have done these readings, what can I do? And my answer is what the gentleman just said. We all have a voice. The First Amendment exists for all of us. And if we all take advantage of that right, and as I see it, that obligation, then whether you are Republican or Democrat, an ACLU member or a Heritage Society member, we can make the system work.